Hello, everyone. If you're looking for a web video session, you're in the right place. If you're looking for something else, you are in the wrong place. My name is Matt Mansfield. I'm a professor at Northwestern University, not here in Chicago, though, in the wonderful campus in Washington, D.C. So don't confuse me with my Evanston and Chicago colleagues. That's why I'm never here and I don't know my way around. So I have the pleasure of being part of this panel today, and we're going to give you some info about us. So we want you to ask questions on Twitter. I'll be monitoring the Twitter stream. I'm at Matt Mansfield. The session hashtag, as you saw, is ONA14WebVid. So if you got questions, we'll take some of them in the end. I got Bill Smee here from NBC News, Drake Martinet from Vice News, Latoya Peterson, who is from Al Jazeera's The Stream, and they're going to talk a little bit about what they do in each one of their shops, show some videos because it's a video session, so we want you to see some work, talk about that. And when they're done, I'll ask them a couple of starter questions, and there's a mic in the middle, and we're hoping you'll ask some questions too. So we're going to start off with Bill, and I'll take it. Bill.
Thanks, Matt, and good to be here. Thanks, everyone, for showing. So I am going to talk a little bit about the world of NBC News and digital video. I joined about a year ago to start up an original video unit for the web and mobile. I spent the first 20 years of my career in TV and was 6 years at Slate before that in a kind of similar role. And the mandate was to kind of create a new breed of video within NBC News, which obviously has vast and awesome video resources and has been doing broadcast news for many, many decades. So the task at hand was to kind of create stuff that was distinctive and original for the web. And we are setting out to prosecute this mission. I'm going to show you a few things along the way and talk a little bit about what I think separates our work and what is kind of absolutely essential to kind of break through the clutter on the web. And I think probably the best thing to do is just talk briefly and say that, you know, as a matter of strategy, we'll talk later about distribution and other challenges, but we set out to create a bunch of different series for NBC News, regular, recurring series, almost all very short form, 2 minutes or less, in a huge range of formats, from, you know, narrated to animation to verite and all points in between, and on a range of subjects from politics to pop culture to science. So let me start by, if you can play the first clip, and then I'll talk a little more after it.
A supermoon is like a regular moon on steroids. But it's not chemistry at work here, it's physics. As you know, the moon changes nightly, going from new to full and back to new again, every 29.5 days. But the moon changes in other ways thanks to its elliptical orbit. The moon's distance from us changes by up to 30,000 miles. So when the moon is full and simultaneously closest to us, it's truly bigger and brighter. About 15% bigger and 30% brighter. I'd say that's pretty super.
So that's one of our series called 30 Seconds to Know, which is one of our signature series, and it is, as you can see, it's a basic explainer, in this case a science piece about the supermoon. We all know about this summer. But I think, you know, one of the things that we think about when we're designing these is there a kind of vector or a little hook or a little gimmick? In this case, it's the counting time clock. But a lot of the other production hallmarks of our work are in this as well. We use a lot of text stuff on screen to kind of augment for additional takeaways that we think helps with obviously mobile consumption, or if you're at the office and can't listen, the more we can sort of put on screen to help people along with information. And the style is obviously also you know, different than broadcast in that we go for a kind of flatter graphic look, very clean, and I say this to those who may be in the room. I realize this is a digital audience, but, you know, on the broadcast side, we deal a lot with flowing, beautiful 3D graphics, which work beautifully on television, not so much for us on the web. So, you know, I think the main thing that I would stress, and I'm going to show another couple pieces of work in a minute, is just we take the view that it's kind of experimental theater, and we believe it's always time to try something new. We'll try anything once, and fortunately, what's been great coming to NBC, I had that great freedom at Slate, and NBC has really extended that to us, which has been a great and pleasant surprise, or shouldn't say surprise. It's just been great. So a couple of other things before I show my next example. I guess I would just say that I think when making, the video for the web, it's just important we think about voice. We use a lot of direct address in a kind of more informal style, as opposed to that kind of sort of Ron Burgundy-esque, 4/4 patter of your terrible TV correspondence. Not that all TV correspondents are terrible, but we all know that voice. And so, it's just, as I said, setting out to kind of make us set apart from the raft of other content that is still going out on NBC's digital platforms, all of the repurposed TV content, which is awesome, and news footage. And I think the last thing I would say to set up in my next clip is just, we really feel like the sweet spot for us in news is kind of explanatory journalism and sort of filling in the blanks, answering questions about processes or things that come up in the news. And the next clip I have is a series we have called Show Me, and it's an animated series that's really a kind of explainer. This one's about gas prices and how they get set.
Anyone with a car knows that gas prices are constantly changing, but probably wonders why. Well, to understand the price of gasoline and where that money goes, you need to know a little something about global demand, geography, and Slurpees. The biggest chunk of your change goes to the people actually producing the oil. That's about 71 cents for each dollar you spend. But it's the traders, not the producers, who set the actual price of a barrel using global supply and demand. Now come the refiners. They took the crude oil, turned it into gasoline, diesel, and other stuff like jet fuel and asphalt. They take about 6 cents of every dollar for gasoline. They get about 11 cents for diesel because even though it costs the same to make, demand is higher. Another factor impacting the cost of gas is how far away the pump is from the refinery. If you're lucky enough to live next to an oil refinery in New Jersey, you'll pay a lot less than if you live in Idaho, where they don't have any oil refineries at all. Transporting oil and gas comes with a price tag too. Another wild card is taxes. Drivers in Alaska pay just 8 cents a gallon. In New York State, you'll owe the tax man 50.6 cents for every gallon you buy. For all those costs, retailers typically come away with just a few pennies per gallon. In fact, some gas stations even lose money on gas in the hope that more people will pull up and buy something else. After all, the margins on Slurpees are much higher.
So again, an explainer. We do a lot of explanatory things in different forms and formats. This animated series, we love the color, we love the graphical style and all the rest. And I just want to pivot to one more thing before I yield the floor to my colleagues here. And the other thing that we have and that we try to do at NBC is to kind of capitalize on our essential NBC-ness. And what is that? Well, it is this great and venerable journalistic institution that has this long track record and has still got awesome news gathering resources all around the world. So one of the things that we do a lot with are the NBC News archives, which go back 60, 70 years. And we do this series called Flashback, where we explicitly mine the archives and create content around news anniversaries or other things spinning out of breaking news. And the clip I'm about to show is something we did around the 25th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. We hooked up with Tom Brokaw, and this is an excerpt from that clip. It was a little bit longer in total, but let her rip.
I landed in Beijing. The place was deathly still. One of the largest capitals in the world, almost not a sound. I had a very resourceful cameraman by the name of Tony Wasserman from South Africa. We'd covered wars all over the world and uprisings in every corner of the planet. And I went out and he had a bicycle and he was putting a soft drink box on the back. And I immediately said, "We're going to put a camera in there, right?" He said, "Absolutely." I know this may seem a little unusual, but it's one of the few ways that we can show you life in the streets of Beijing without getting in trouble with the authorities. We took off not knowing whether I was going to get shot or whether they were going to pull this off or not. And I rode behind Tony. I was wired up, and we could sync it up later. And to our surprise, no one stopped us. Only one Chinese bicyclist bicycled up behind Tony, reached to the box and tickled the lens and then drove away. So that worked so well, I went on the air that night showing for the first time Tiananmen Square post raid by the government military. Talking with the soldiers these days, the gap between the people and the People's Liberation Army is enormous after the Tiananmen massacre. Despite those
earlier reports during the trouble that it was fighting within the Chinese military. We've seen nothing here except a complete military crackdown.
So with that, I think a little flourish of gonzo undercover. Maybe I should yield the floor to my good colleague Drake at Vice, and I'll have more to say in a few minutes.
That just all of those warmed my heart for various reasons, including I definitely saw a little bit of the Now This News style in the center with my ex-colleague Wynn doing the voiceover. Hi everybody, I'm Drake Martinet. I'm head of platform for Vice News, and for those whom we haven't reached yet, we're trying very hard. Vice News is a 7-month-old news venture from Vice Media. We're run and headquartered out of Brooklyn and New York, and we're doing all kinds of interesting, amazing things. I'm just going to let the work speak for itself to start with, and I'll give you a little backstory after I show you what we do.
We just want to make great stories. You know, we like to get into places and see things that other people don't see, things that no one has ever shown.
In the last 6 months, you have 9,000 IEDs. That's an IED?
You're in the action, you're with the people who are involved with it, you're seeing how something affects people.
You're following a person into a world.
I wanted to punch you in the face. Did you see that? Can you believe that?
I think we're trying to show the world as it really is.
This isn't necessarily the stuff people put in their papers, stuff that national media covers. Figure out what they're saying, because I think something might be an issue.
What you're going to see on Vice is not going to be sanitized. There's a lot of things that are happening out there. Somebody should be saying something about this.
What are the big important questions to ask here?
So this is in a favela called Rocinha, which is being pacified.
Are you here with the consent of the population?
Aqui é processo e operações militares.
To be able to go out into the world and see these things, it gives you incredible perspective.
Hanging out the front door of the palace. Looks like they're trying to bust it down.
We have a lot of stories that are going to really have people sitting up and taking notice of what's happening today globally.
Apparently there's cameras there. I think that's a camera right there.
You wouldn't be able to get.
What can you shoot down with this? Helicopters, MiGs?
Everything.
These are young documentary filmmakers who are offering a look at these countries that you wouldn't see anywhere else.
That's the kind of work we do, and we think it's important to tell people stories.
What we want to do is immerse ourselves in the situation. We have to press record, and we have to watch this as it happens.
Jesus!
We have to be here chronicling this.
It's always impossible to say anything after that. It just comes to a crescendo, and then you just want to let it happen. So that was obviously real. That was a reel of a mix between some stuff that came out as part of Vice on HBO, and then also sort of interspersed with Vice News, and that gets to what it was that was the motivation behind starting Vice News. So Vice has been it's a 20-year-old startup that started in Canada, came to New York, and has been based out of New York for quite some time now. And it, through launching various verticals, we have Motherboard, which is tech, we have Noisy, which is music, we have Thump, which is just electronic dance music, we have Vice Sports now. I think the founders, Shane and Sarush especially, knew that there was something they wanted to do around news. I think Vice on HBO was in many cases, in many ways, our first iteration of how Vice was going to do news, and you see us sort of discovering a lot of things about news if you watch Vice on HBO season 1. Around the time that season 2 was in development, they got together and said, we're gonna do this for real. This is maybe the most important thing we've ever done, and we're going to do it persistently, and we're gonna do it 24/7 on the web, and it's gonna have a home. And that was sort of the kernel of Vice News. And so a short 7 months ago, we launched into a public beta, and we've been going ever since. We're the fastest growing thing that Vice has ever done. I'm incredibly exhausted, but I'm trying to think of a time when I've worked with as many people that are as good at what they do. Doing stuff that looks like that, and I'm not a producer, doing stuff that looks like that requires an incredible level, an enviable level of technical acumen and dedication and understanding. Everyone in the room who's a shooter, who's a producer, who's an editor understands that. And they don't make it look easy, but they work tirelessly at it. I'm going to show one more clip, which I think is something we did right ahead of the launch, if I'm not mistaken. Sort of a why.
We've been going around the world talking to people about the big issues that matter to them and how they want the news to cover them.
London, England.
Mexico City.
Beirut, Tel Aviv.
Tokyo, Japan.
If you want to tell us what you think is important, you can do it with #ViceNews.
My parents' generation grew up with broadcast TV, 3 stations, 3 news anchors.
And that's the way it is.
We don't have 3 channels, we have 3,000 channels.
There's a revolution going on in the media right now, and you need to be a part of it.
The way that people are getting their news is evolving every day, and that's not even an exaggeration.
This generation is so bombarded with information, it's very difficult to look back and understand what this means.
Budgets are being cut, newspapers are closing down.
Standard news channel, there's maybe like 5 or 6 stories rolling each day, and that can't be all that's going on.
You find that people actually have a lot more in common than that which divides us. But you wouldn't know that when you listen to our politicians speak or when you listen to the mainstream media who are so interested in talking about what separates us.
We should do something about it.
Now with the help of technology and social media and the new means of communication, it has become easier for a person to express himself loud.
You can really get your voice out there, not just to your own country, but to the whole world.
I hate hearing that my generation is lazy. There are absolutely people my age around the world that feel the same way that I do.
The internet, the new tools on our disposal, the revolutions, the uprisings, these are all methods towards changing the way people access information, gather information.
Every day, brings with it new adventures and new stories.
The true stories, not just what the government and other media platforms want to show.
I think information must be free. It's very important for us.
Everything that's going on around us, we care about it, we care about our futures.
Part of being an adult is engaging with the world.
I think there's an opportunity here to really engage young people in news again.
News is all about what's happening with the humankind, what's happening in the human condition.
We all have the chance to interact with each other and learn about each other's lives. This is how the modern world works across the globe.
So, the only other thing I'll say, and I'd much rather you guys ask questions at the end, and I can tell you whatever it is I can tell you, but there's a maniacal focus to the story at Vice News, and you see that in say, how we format things. Some things, formats have evolved. We do dispatches from the Ukraine. We're heading on 80 or 90 of them now. And these things are, turned around very quickly. These are, daily or every other day, whenever the story warrants it. They're cut short. They're, I would say not low production value, but they're more raw than maybe some of the reels you just saw. And the point is to put the shortest distance between the user and the situation by way of a camera and the internet. And then you look at a bunch of other stuff we do. There's that's the most recent example I can think of. Yesterday I watched something we produced called Asian Carpocalypse, which if you live in this region of the country, the Asian carp is a massively invasive species that, depending upon who you talk to, is either a problem or delicious. And, that piece took weeks. It was 45 minutes long. And that's what the story needed. That particular story, there was a 45-minute piece inside that story. Sometimes there's a 15-minute piece, sometimes it's 4 minutes, sometimes it's 40 seconds. The story dictates, and I think the great thing about the mediums we choose to publish on is that we can publish at any length we want. We're not, the formats serve the story, at least in this case, not the other way around necessarily. there's a maniacal focus on the story. And in terms of how it's different, and I don't know, maybe that's a question we'll get to, but, you know, I guess I see it as it's a little bit sort of video news goes to film school. Everything is very character driven. But there are very few tropes. You don't meet a person who represents a population. This is X. This is their first name. You don't know who they are. They are all of these people. You meet a person, an individual, and I think through that person and through their reality and understanding a little bit more about them as a human being in each of these stories, you connect with that news and that information, and you internalize it in a way that you don't if that person is just representing a population. I don't know. That's what I connect with in all of our stories is the people. And I don't know. Ask questions later. I'll tell you whatever I can.
Cool. All right, so hi, I'm Latoya Peterson. I'm currently the senior digital producer for the stream at Al Jazeera America. I'm also the editor and owner of Racialicious.com, which is a blog about race and culture and all of the interesting things that intersect with those 2 points. And so a lot of my work with video in particular has been around being less of a practitioner, but more of a person who is an analyst and someone who tries to understand what makes stories popular and what makes stories resonate. Right? And so earlier, Bill had talked a little bit about the power of voice, right? And where voice is and how voice is kind of missing from television news, you know, and we can talk about ethics, I think, a little bit later, how voice is missing, but trying to bring that in. Vice, clearly where Drake works, is definitely full of voice. You guys know the Vice voice. And then for me, one of the things that's always been interesting, one of the things that led me to this career path, is trying to figure out what voices resonate, right? What stories are so powerful that other people see themselves inside of them? Before we had the internet, we had advertising, right? So most people remember that MasterCard commercial where you list out the prices of things, you talk about something being free, and then they tell for everything else there's MasterCard, and that spawned tons of imitators, tons of people remaking this in their own image, and it was a very, very powerful message, right? But now we have the internet, and we have memes, and we have all of these different things, and so I always wondered, particularly with videos that became popular, what was it about that one video in particular that made people not only want to watch the story, but see themselves in it? And a few years ago, the perfect example of this came up with the viral phenomenon, Shit Girls Say. Is anyone not familiar with Shit Girls Say? Okay. Because if not, the next video doesn't make sense.
We're judging you if you aren't.
Yeah, we're judging you. But one of the things that I've loved about Shit Girls Say, particularly from a racial and gender background, is how many immediate send-ups came about that were racially based and people trying to discuss the girls they knew only with their own ethnic flair and their own flip to it. Ultimately, Shit Girls Say was, you know, a hit, and it was, when the last time I checked, people had created 700 different response videos. And at some point I stopped, so I'm sure there's like thousands at this point, but 700 different response videos with just shit blank says, right? But one thing in particular is that even when we're telling these stories that seem like they don't relate to us, there's always these interesting, weird notes of commonality. These are the things that make us human, and it just might just look a little bit different from place to place. And so I want to show kind of like the first video.
Yummy. So difficult. Were you talking to that girl on Facebook today?
So what's interesting is that all these videos are self-created, right? And it's like, I was like, why is that like the one thing, like food, like you're eating on your boyfriend and you're like really like going in on something very crunchy? Why was that the thing that resonated so that it appeared in like every other video? Like I was like, why did that happen? I only picked 4, but like literally, we published a piece about it when I was doing talks about memes called the problematic and subversive shit people say, that goes into kind of like the mutation of the whole meme. So it started out with shit people say and then all the racial variations. Then it was, you know, shit X says to Y, most famously by Francesca Lee, who ended up doing, you know, shit white girls say to black girls, which spawned its own whole like cottage industry of response videos. And then finally people just completely twisting the meme for more social justice points. Like there was a really great one called Shit Everyone Says to Rape Victims, which is very powerful and very sad. and very interesting. But again, it resonated, and it resonated so far that it had these far-reaching effects. And that, I feel like, is where those of us who are creating video to share need to be thinking about. We're thinking about not only the story that we want to share and what we want to get out to the world, but also this idea of figuring out, well, what is the commonality of the story? What is going to make someone feel invested in it, regardless of what their background is? And so there's these ideas that memes form and change based on what we have. And now we're in the age of micro video, which I find fascinating. Because what kind of stories can you tell in 6 seconds, all right? What are we really saying here? I mean, I feel like, Vice is doing really great documentaries that are like 15 minutes long, 20 minutes long. But it's like, how do you get to storytelling, right? What do we do? And yet, there's this whole group of people, most of them very, very young, who are starting to master the idea of particularly comedic storytelling on Vine. So we can go to the second video.
A tiptoeing thief danced his way into a garage and stole the man's bike.
So that is normally, when you see news on Vine, that's what it is. It's news of the weird, right? And it's normally someone who saw this and they were like, that was hilarious, and normally it's local news. Like, it's almost never national news on Vine. It's always local news. And someone sees something, they go, okay, let's mix this up a little bit. Let me add something to this and make the story my own, right? So the tiptoe into my Jordan's thief is now one of the most popular things on Vine. But there's other ways to continue to tell these stories. You can do the next one.
Believe me. Yo, check this out. Let me see that. Oh, Lord. Hey, what we learned.
So that is actually a very, very popular sub-series called What We Learn. And it's essentially a lot of scenarios just like this one. That happened to be my favorite, personally, of people teaching each other like these 6, 7, like think of it as like a new age Aesop's fable, right? What are we doing here? What is going on? Legendarius, who is the gentleman in the yellow right there, is one of my favorite comedians on Vine, and he's done this really, really interesting blend of comedy and storytelling, and he's gotten hundreds of thousands of revines and hundreds of thousands of followers. And one of the ways is the way that he's able to craft a story, even if the story feels kind of impossible, in 6 seconds. And so the last clip that I want to show is another one from Legendarius.
So when you first started getting symptoms? About a week ago. What was that? A week ago.
Fuck with us and then we tweaking, run up on.
I could not. And if you don't know what this is, please do not Google it. I'm writing a very, very long piece on race and performance on Vine for Racialicious that will help contextualize some of this. But I don't think I can talk about Vine without including at least one shmoney dance, at least one. And I will send out the link once that's up. But understanding kind of like what resonates with people, what people love to share, what they see themselves in. So the shmoney dance is actually a very popular rap video that became a meme, just because in the middle of what is kind of a very standard video at this point, like the aesthetic of the time, a very standard music video, guys yelling in a circle, a Mustang driving through, random threats against people's lives, all the like usual rap tropes. In the middle of it, this guy just does this ridiculous dance that everyone started loving. And so suddenly, Vine is now full of people doing the shmoney dance. People are putting the shmoney dance on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. People are putting the shmoney dance on, football players or before performances. And so looking at the ways in which people saw themselves or saw something that they could do, and they decided immediately to start participating. And I think ultimately that's what news wants to try to do. We want to spur people into active participation, be it in society, in the voting process. We're writing these stories because we care, and we're writing these stories because we want a certain type of outcome. And so, to tie this all up, one of the biggest things I would encourage, particularly those of us who are looking at creating videos and sharing, is to spend a lot of time figuring out what people are doing, even if it feels a little ridiculous in the beginning, even if it feels a little bit like, well, I'm not really doing that for news. Understanding that where this inspiration can come from and what it can lead us toward ultimately is the whole point of this endeavor, right? Of figuring out how to better communicate with people, with everyday people who might not ever watch or turn on a news broadcast intentionally, but they totally caught the tiptoeing thief from Georgia because it was on Vine.
All right, so thank you first to LaToya, Drake, and Bill. I got a couple of questions to start us out, and if you have questions, there's a mic right there in the middle. I'd encourage you to come up and ask your questions. We'll get to them whenever you're ready. I want to start out because I think it was really interesting hearing you all talk a little bit about formats and what works, and I'm just fascinated when Drake said It's like video news goes to film school, which is definitely an aesthetic, a vice that has been crafted, I think, really carefully, and so it has an interesting voice. NBC News has a different voice because it's been around for a long time, but you're still trying to remix things. And so I'd like to just hear your thoughts on what's different from starting up something, which is what Vice got to do, to Bill, who has to deal with the legacy, or maybe it's a wonderful thing to have such a great legacy. And you talked, LaToya, about this idea of connecting the audience and making them feel like they're part of it. What do they like to share? So it would just be great to just hear about formats a little bit and why you choose to tell the stories in the way that you do, and whether, if you're in a legacy organization, you're encumbered by your past, or could you free yourself from it? So who wants to start? Bill.
I was going to say, I think Bill should start, because I actually think that he's got a bigger license to talk about breaking out of the format of his forebear with what we saw here versus NBC traditional.
Sure, so I'll go. Well, I think the first thing I would say is, and I said it earlier, it's just, to me, the format, the idea that there are fixed formats it should be the first mistake, because you should always be experimenting with new ideas and new formats. And in our case, we take that to heart. We're always minting new sort of iterations. But in terms of the legacy, yeah, I mean, there's a very set way of doing things on TV and TV news. I worked at CNN for 15 years, so I know a little bit about that. And, it can be an encumbrance in the sense that people around the building have a set picture of what video news looks like. But the reality is that enough people now are digitally savvy and or open to trying new things that we can bring them along. And the further reality is we have a discrete and separate digital operation, and my team is on the digital team, so we're not tasked with creating new talent vehicles for NBC News correspondents, though we are happy to be working with a number of them, and of course we do. And of course Tom Brokaw was in that clip that I showed you, to name one. But I do think it is a challenge, not just internally, but I just think we're in a point in history where no one has really cracked the code on what web video can and should be. Let's not kid ourselves. And I think there's also a further temptation sometimes on digital to say, oh, well, I've got unlimited bandwidth. I want to tell you my earnest story about the artisanal pickler who I met. And I have a friend who's an artisanal pickler, by the way, so I can say that. But, that's also an error. Just because you can go 22 minutes or 27 minutes, you should be more disciplined in your storytelling. Now, to your point earlier, I haven't seen the film, but that's a great point. If it warrants 45 minutes and people think it's super interesting, then by all means, that's the great thing about digital. You don't have to hit some dumb, arbitrary commercial break or cue tone, and that's really powerful. And I guess the last thing I would say is, even though we are dabbling in a lot of different formats, we're not eschewing all tradition. We're now doing some verite doc style stuff. That's in my background. I did documentary for many, many years. It's near and dear to my heart. So I just think one of the great things about digital is there's really room for everything. And you're not constrained in ways that you can be at a cable or broadcast network.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Sort of not constrained by anything is, I don't know, there's some saying about constraint being one of the things that can bring great creativity. And so in many cases, I think video on the web has experienced this crisis of freedom, that we could do literally anything. So what do we do? And everyone's sort of juggling the tropes they know and the formats they like into these totally new boxes and packages and use cases, which is a whole other thing to think about when you think about formats. When I think about formats, and I want to preface this by saying, I said it before, I'm not an editor or producer. I think about how our things, all the things that we make, get to people, and how they interpret them and how they consume them and how they relate to them. And I think about format for story and format for use case. And those are two very different constraints, but are both at play. So format for story is what I talked about before, which is that, it's easy to say, let the story dictate it, but the reality is a 45-minute documentary is probably not going to be watched by somebody at work in the bathroom on their iPhone. Let's all be honest. That's unlikely to happen. That said, that doesn't mean you shouldn't make that. And that said, if you commit to the story of the 45-minute Asian carp, and it's great, that means the burden's on you when you think of formats to think about how you can bring that story to people in multiple ways. Are there photos that you can bring them to that will bring them into the documentary later? Can the Vice News app was just launched, and we integrated with a new part of the iOS 8 SDK where you can be watching a documentary at wherever on your desktop, and when you open up that app, as long as your Apple ID is connected on both ends, you'll go to the same spot in your doc later. Same thing with an article. It's called handoff. And so that's a case where you can use technology to help people connect with the format that the story needed. That's a very wordy way of saying that. I think the other thing that I think Bill's stuff was a great showcase of, and before this, I was a co-founder at Now This News. There's actually another one of them in the room this evening. And we thought a lot about what does it mean to watch video on mobile. And you saw, and you see sort of lighter examples of the same stuff in a lot of what Vice does. We do think about viewing on a smaller screen. What does that mean? Lower thirds, maybe not exactly the same as they needed as they used to be. There was a reason they were that way. That way doesn't exist for us. So we do something else. It's the great thing about having an experienced staff at Vice News, and then I'll shut up and we can ask more questions hopefully, is that if you have the experience of great journalists and great producers, they know what happened before, and you can learn from everything. You can learn from all the best of what came before, and then you know exactly what you can break to make a 20-second or 30-second explainer make sense with big takeaways, or you know that you can scrape away the entire lower third of a raw clip because any place anyone's going to see that is going to be on the web, and at the top of it there's going to be a headline that is going to be the same as the lower third, and anyone who's going to share it is going to share it in a tweet, and that tweet's going to be the same as the lower third. So it's never going, the lower third adds context, but the way it's viewed on the web will never be out of that context. Any place you put it, there it is right there. So rethinking all the stuff that needs to be rethought and not throwing all the great lessons out with the bathwater is, it's not complicated. It's just 1,000 tiny decisions that we try and think about all of.
Latoya, anything?
Yeah, really quick. I did want to address something that I saw on Twitter just recently, because somebody goes, what is the news value of Shit Girls Say? And I'm like, that's a really interesting and very newsy question. To me, I'm kind of like, you could ask, what is the news value of all of these goofy videos I just showed you? Or you can ask, what can I learn from these things that we can then apply to news and apply to news gathering? I had a conversation with a good friend of mine who works for a traditional big broadcast outlet, and I was showing him Vine, and he goes, we are never going to be able to tell a news story in 6 seconds. And I was like, you remember that people said that about Twitter, that there's never going to be a way that you can do substantial news or headlines in 140 characters, right? So it's an idea about perception. So with that in mind, I don't have anything directly, I think, addressing what Bill and Drake have already explained, but there are two things that I did want to bring up in terms of looking at being a practitioner and looking at what we do. Being in the television world has been a interesting experience for me as someone who's completely digital. So if I had one thing to tell you guys to steal from TV, it is this: script to visuals, right? It's like if you've gone to film school, if you've done television news production, this is like a basic and you don't think about it. If you're coming from the internet, a lot of the reasons why a lot of our things are, quite frankly, very boring when it comes into longer formats is because we're not scripting the visuals. We're thinking about the whole story, but we're not thinking about specifically telling a visual story. And if we're doing video, you would think that's the first thing people foreground, but it's not, right? And I love the New York Times dearly, but every time I'm on JetBlue and I'm watching like the Cook with Mark Bittman stuff, and I'm like, we need new visuals, please help that out, right? So we could steal that from television, right? Figure out scripting the visuals, figure out how to tell a visual story first. Get your visuals in place and then figure out what is the story that you need to flow around it. And then the thing to steal from the internet is that everything will break, and break all of your assumptions every single year, right? because we're in this time that's amazing, and we're creating all kinds of new things. We're looking at news and what does news mean for Oculus Rift. My friend Noni De La Pena did this amazing piece that was virtual reality news gathering and news showing, right? But it was only because she was willing to break assumptions about what news could be, and she's still working through like the ethics of that and what happens, what do we do when we recreate situations for people to virtually experience. Those are all really, really tangible questions that we're going to keep wrestling with. But this idea of continually breaking the model, breaking what we know before, and trying to forge new ground is something that I feel like a lot of producers particularly news producers, can take from the internet.
Okay, cool. I had some more questions about formats, but there are, looks like 6 people in line. So I'm glad that you all covered how to photograph, edit, package, and present for the medium, which I think was my next question. So I'm just going to kick it back to the middle of the room, and if you would just, if it's for a specific panelist, let us know who it's for. If it's for all of them, we'll just open it up wide.
Well, the thought is we sell advertising and we are an ad-supported enterprise. Our ad sales team does a great job and they do package ad sales deals, and frequently clients will service ads that are 30 seconds. We obviously prefer the shorter ad because it's a better user experience, but we, as a matter of course, run pre-roll advertising in front of all of our videos. So it's not something we kind of control and say, oh, we'll do it here but not there. I mean, there'll be certain special cases for making exemptions, but it is how we make our money. Like probably everyone in this room, we can all agree that seeing a 30-second ad in front of a minute and 12 video is not super optimal, but it's kind of the world we live in.
I think the good news is that a lot of smart advertisers are looking at the success of these shorter formats and mobile formats, and they're insisting on innovation in the ad products that are served in front and behind and betwixt those things. So, I mean, my hope is that just as we're all pushing on trying to come up with the great new video formats, there's going to be our counterparts, in the creative services space that are going to make great new ads that don't make you hate the people advertising.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
I've totally had that conversation with people and had that argument with people where I'm like, we cannot put a 45-second ad up before a 45-second clip. That is ridiculous. Like, we can't do that. But I think it's interesting because, again, barriers are breaking down. And so there used to be like this huge gap between product and editorial, right? For many, many very good reasons. But now it's kind of like if salespeople are selling these long ads and they're like, well, this is what we run on TV and we just want to stick that on the web. That's not going to work, right? We have to figure out what's new. And I think it's very interesting and very telling that outfits like BuzzFeed and Upworthy are working with advertisers to create their own like native advertising that fits more with what they're doing. At the same time, when like big advertising firms like Animal in New York are getting into kind of like their sponsored content, right? Like everything, they're like, okay, ads, people are tuning them out, so how about we just go ahead and just integrate it? And I think that in the next like maybe 4 or 5 years, we'll start to see a really interesting conversation, like almost like the new grammar of advertising, right? It'll look completely different, I think, particularly as we get to more micro video.
Thank you.
All right, got another question back here.
I'm Scott Baker, editor-in-chief of The Blaze, founding editor. Continuing on the economic issue a little bit, if you guys could define down a little bit, because I exist in a world where I run on cash flow and not on venture capital. And so when I'm watching the NBC piece and it's showing the economic breakdown in the pennies, I'm looking and thinking, exactly how much did it cost to produce that explainer versus how many views did it bring in, how much pre-roll did it do? I look at Vice and I'm envious because you have channel sponsorships that are CPMs that are like 30,000 or something like that, it would seem to me. But for a lot of people that have to exist in kind of a real world of CPMs, what advice do you give on how many videos do you produce that just don't make any money? I looked at Vice the other day and there was a video of a kid telling hardcore pedophilia jokes that had hundreds of thousands of views. And there was a really good piece on another Vice page that had like 10,000 views but was really substantive. This one obviously probably didn't make any money. How do you balance that?
I'll go first. First of all, the economics of making video on the web profitable, it's challenging. It's daunting. One of the great advantages that we have at NBC is we have the kind of scale that a lot of operations don't have, including where I used to work at Slate, where we did some very fine work, I think, but we could never quite achieve the scale. So, we're publishing scores and scores of news clips every day in addition to the custom original video that my team is creating. And so that helps us because in the aggregate, that raises our traffic to a level that we can sell against. I'm not going to get into how much it costs to make individual videos or what the break-even point is. I would just say that even in our world, all video production is not created equally. Those animations, we work with outside animators for those. They're a little more expensive, though I promise you, compared to what you would spend on a TV production, they're like an order of magnitude less. But there are other things we do, like a 30 Seconds to Know, where it's just sweat equity and an expert. Sometimes it's an outside person like you saw, or it's an NBC News correspondent. So, we work, again, in the same way that we're creative in different formats. It's not a one-size-fits-all price point either. But I'm not going to lie, you're absolutely right. Some of our videos that we think are awesome don't get a great view count, and that's disappointing. But I'm lucky to work at a place where we also have great, crazy car chase videos and other things that will run up the score, so to speak.
Yeah, it's really hard. I think there's a lot of, I think everyone is putting together a business model that's got a lot of inputs. That's how it will get done. Vice's particular solution to this problem is making the most amazing video that you can find on the internet. Extremely, premium is a real word for us. The things that you find on the web are premium to a level that you would normally only see on an HBO. And then making sure that we have a very robust operation to keep us in that business. It's a 45-minute long answer. So talk to me after if you want to.
Just a quick jump in, is there some also longer form content that deserves a certain kind of underwriting? Because, that is a model that you see. If you look at Vox.com, GE was sponsoring some of their explainer videos in the early going, and that they want to be associated with a certain kind and style of video. So someone might underwrite it, General Electric or Acura or BMW, somebody with deep pockets might say, I'm good with that. I don't want any pre-roll. I want to be associated with this kind of premium experience. So is that another way to try to solve some of those?
Well, it is, although it's still an ad-supported model. We do custom ad experiences. We were part of that GE program as well. And you're right, there is that kind of halo effect. We want to be associated with that content, but, the more ambitious the content, the more pricey it is to produce.
Right?
So,
sure.
I would just say, having worked in TV for as many years as I did, it's incredible how thrifty you can be if you really put your mind to it. And that's no lie. The budgets for web video are low, and you're right, the challenge for making it profitable, given view counts, is there. But, given all the technology and desktop editing and cameras and all the rest, it's astonishing to me how much we can get done for a relatively modest price point.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Should we go to the next question?
Hi, I'm Jason Breslow. I'm with Frontline, and I have a question about YouTube. And what I was curious about is whether your approach to storytelling changes to how it changes to appeal to a YouTube audience versus video you might just produce specifically for your own websites.
Do you mean YouTube versus like a different format like on the HBO show, or YouTube versus if we put it in our own player?
Like if you put it in your own player.
Oh, okay. I don't know that we think about production as being fundamentally separate between YouTube or, say the Uyala player, which we also use, and we use them for different reasons. I think again, I'll sort of step back and say it's more thinking about use case than it is about one player technology, one that's hosted on a Google server versus hosted on another server that we pay somebody else for. I think that it's more like, okay, this is in a web player. Is this being consumed in a web player? One, is it being consumed in a web player within an ecosystem that begets additional video consumption, like YouTube? Or is it being consumed within a web player, say on our own platform, on our O&O, on the web, in an app? And in that case, the user isn't really differentiated by the fact that they're watching a web player. They're differentiated by use case, time of day, platform, whether or not they've got a Wi-Fi versus cell connection. These are things we think about, but one player versus another isn't necessarily a huge production concern, I don't think.
Okay, we got time for a couple more questions. There's one more back there.
Hi there. Quick question for Bill. You showed us some examples of experiments that your team has initiated. I'm curious about any experiments that the NBC News reporters, the TV reporters, have tried for the web, if any. And if no examples come to the top of your mind, I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to see those TV reporters experiment with on the web.
Sure. Well, our broadcast reporters contribute to the website frequently, writing pieces and contributing to news gathering that way. But we actually do work already with NBC News correspondents on many of the series, including a couple that I showed you. I mean, 30 Seconds to Know, Dr. Nancy Snyderman, who's the chief medical correspondent for NBC News, has done a number of those. We've done one of our debunker explainers with Al Roker. So we look for opportunities to do to utilize this talent, because it's great, and they're expert and they're authorities, and they're great journalists.
I mean, what about out in the field, though? Let's say somebody's
Sure.
filing a story. They already have to file 2 minutes for the 6 o'clock news. They have to do live hits for their all news channel, let's say. What else could they do in addition to that for the web?
Well, the hope is that amid their ample day job, we'll find opportunities where they can do original work with us, and that's in fact what we're doing. I'm not totally sure I understand what you mean by, I mean, if they're busy during the course of a breaking news day doing a lot of live shots and or filing a piece for nightly news, that's probably not a great day for us to dive in, although we actually do these little short reporter dispatches with some of them kind of on the fly. But it's our hope that we can work with the various reporters on their various beats on days when they're not crazed for a nightly news piece to craft something that works for us. And we've found plenty of great and cooperative takers. So you're going to see, I think, more of that as we go forward. Although, again, it's not a definition. We don't have some quota that we're trying to hit.
Thanks.
Sure.
All right, sir, you get the last question in the room. We've got one more from Twitter, and we'll end with the Twitter question. So you're good to go.
Okay, Rob Hasso from Middle Tennessee State University. Considering the video savviness of citizen journalists and DIY journalists, what is your take on its impact on traditional journalistic norms in a newsroom, like gatekeeping and agenda setting?
Well, I mean, I think people who are places where things are happening make great sources, regardless of whether they capture it on their camera or you talk to them about it. And I think that any modern news operation is going to be looking to people in many cases when something happens, especially in remote places where we like to send people, the first things you see come from somebody who's got, a Nokia camera phone that, thank goodness, is increasingly less shaky. I think it's a tool. It's something to weave into what you do. It's a way to help you understand what's going on. It's a way for you to talk to somebody who you can and begin to verify that they were there and what happened. And it's great. It makes our jobs easier and harder and faster all at the same time. I think we're all good with it.
Okay, last question is from Twitter. This summer we witnessed sort of this great participation in the Ice Bucket Challenge. And the question from Twitter is whether there's anything to be learned from that about participatory journalism or crafting news that people can feel involved with and be part of in the way that LaToya described the Vine videos, making you feel like you're part of something. Is there anything we can learn from something like challenging our audience to do something like that?
So I think that the bigger question that we get at when we ask these kind of questions is how is news evolving and how is news changing, right? Because normally when we advocate for people to take part in challenges, it starts to feel like we're promoting certain things over others, right? It can start to feel, get against these kind of things, we start thinking about bias, right? And so while it's fun to be like, yes, let's do it, when we start saying, okay, here's how to take action on the news that you're watching, it becomes a very, very sticky place to be, right? And it becomes very ethically strange. Like, if we want to advocate for certain things. Like, I came to news through social justice, right? Because I believed in an informed populace. And I decided the best way to do that was kind of through looking at the mass media that people consume. But there's a reason why we had certain standards in place. And while we can learn a lot from stuff like the Ice Bucket Challenge, particularly because it didn't work the first time, it didn't work the second time. I think that goes back to the person from the Blaze's comment. Where it's kind of like, how do we make money? Well, sometimes you just have to keep trying to do stuff and then pop, something happens and you're like, oh, this is great. Now that sucks when we're spending money and you're not in a venture capital bubble, but that's kind of where we are right now. Everything is very open for grabs. We're looking at a new kind of era for news in terms of understanding who we are and who we can be. Can we do challenges? I mean, I think that there's always a place for various things from the internet to come into the newsroom and to leave, but I think that a bigger question is how do we understand what people are looking from in news when so many people are turning away from news in favor of other things? And it's not like this has been a secret, right? It's always been a bigger margin in stuff like entertainment and business than there has been for particularly news and particularly the expensive investigative part, right? So maybe the learning that we have from the Ice Bucket Challenge is learning how to fund investigative through really fun, viral, crowd-funded campaigns, which takes the pressure off. Maybe that's what it is. But I think it's one of those things that's going to be a long, multi-year conversation, and it starts with us realizing that, okay, maybe news is the product that we used to think it was, the idea that it's an essential product for most people, and starting to kind of rebuild our assumptions from there.
I think that you saw that the second piece I did was actually a part of a campaign we did at the launch of Vice News called The People Speak, and it was it was as much us expressing what we were about and wanted to be about as it was asking our current and future users what they wanted us to be about. It was sort of one part need finding and one part throwing the door open and saying, this is something a little bit different, we want to hear from you. I would say that only shares things with the Ice Bucket Challenge so much in that doing that, there would have been no vehicle to even do something like that 10 years ago. 5 years ago, it would have even been much harder. And so I think the most important thing we could all possibly do is ask questions exactly like the one that just got asked on Twitter. And when you try and answer it for yourselves or your company, I think it's like, okay, maybe there is something we can learn from this. Does that mean that we should all do the Ice Bucket Challenge? No, absolutely not. Know what your value proposition to your user is, understand them, and try and connect with them in a way that brings them utility. And that makes them want to come back. And for us, our Ice Bucket Challenge was going to the users and saying, anywhere you are, no matter what you want to talk about, tell us what that is, submit by any means necessary around a given hashtag. You didn't have to be a response video, because as video's hard as it turns out. Tell us what you're about. And we got a lot of great responses around that. It was a lot of Twitter feedback and people saying, you need to see this. This is happening in my town. You need to see this. I lived with these people for 5 years when I was in the Peace Corps. That traveled under its own power for a little bit for us, and that means, maybe that's something we could have learned from something like the Ice Bucket Challenge. I mean, we preempted a little bit, but yeah.
All right, I think we're out of time. Thanks to the panelists for the great stuff. And that's a wrap. And thanks for everybody on Twitter who asked questions and joined us. Thanks, it was awesome.